So I wrote this haiku out of compassion for any of us who does behavior consulting with clients, because it is not easy. And the way this presentation came about was odd, because when I was asked to speak here, I realized immediately that I would be speaking to my peers, which was a completely new experience because I always speak to caregivers. And so I asked Susan Friedman what she thought I should talk about. And she said, well, I think you should talk about your experience because it's been so vast and what you've learned about it. And initially I thought, well, nobody's going to want to listen to that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there have been some really important things that I've distilled from my experience that I think are essential skills for Parrot behavior consultants. So I went ahead and went with it. I hope it is enriching for all of you. So I'm going to be 65 next month, and I have had, thank you. May 18th, you can all send me birthday wishes. At any rate, I got my first pair of birds when I was 12. So I've had birds all my life, essentially. And initially, they were small birds. My first birds were a pair of lovebirds. Then I went on to have cockatiels and budgies. I even bred cockatiels at one point with my youngest son when he was about the same age I was when I first got birds. But a moment happened to me when I was 19 years old. I walked into a pet store in Newport Beach, California, and I encountered an African gray parrot that was sitting there on some boring play stand with nothing to do. And my eyes met his, and it was one of the most profound experiences of my life. I'd never seen a parrot before other than the small birds, but I could not just grasp the intelligence and the sentience and the depth of experience that rested in those eyes. And it really made a lasting impression upon me. And so I decided that when I was older and could afford it, I would get my own African gray parrot. But the problem was, when that day came, when I was in my 30s, I went to go visit breeders to adopt a baby African gray parrot, and that was back in the days when there were still a lot of hobby breeders who were doing a really pretty good job. But I couldn't find a baby that I wanted to adopt, because when I would attempt to interact with them, they would all huddle towards the back of the cages. They seemed very shy, not at all interested in interacting with me. And I thought, there is something wrong here. A baby parrot should be curious. They should be friendly. And so in my naive arrogance, I decided I'll just breed my own. My whole life, I have kind of gone by the principle that everything is figure-outable. And that is why you are now seeing this presentation, because I just wasn't going to give up. I thought it's got to be there somewhere. I'm going to figure it out. So I may have missed lunch, but I got it back. And I was lucky enough along the way to encounter Phoebe Linden. She was breeding parrots too at that time, and was also a behavior consultant long before I was. And so she took me under her wing and she mentored me, and it was a very good experience because the babies that we produced were extraordinary. This was back in the day when you would read in almost every publication that African gray parrots were nervous, clumsy birds. And that is not true at all. That relates solely to the way that they were being reared. I think the standard rearing practices, again, which I talked about this morning, are to force wean babies before they ordinarily would, if allowed to within their own time frames, and to never allow them to fledge and learn to fly. And I think there are some species that can survive that experience. For instance, Amazons. We've made observations of them in the wild, and the parents really don't spend that much time in the nest cavity with those babies. So perhaps they adapt a little better. That's not to say that they should be raised this way, but I guess what I'm trying to say is they're not quite as damaged as some of these other species are, like African grays, by these more typical rearing experiences that the bigger breeders practice. And so it was Phoebe Linden who coined the term abundance weaning, and that just meant that the babies were allowed to become food independent at their own pace. That didn't mean that you didn't do anything. You did support them within that process in different ways that really is not within the compass of this presentation. And then she was fledging babies as well. And so I followed her pattern. And in the beginning, I fledged babies for 2 weeks because that's what she was doing. And I gradually clipped them back. And I saw such amazing gains in terms of their personality development that I thought, well, what would happen if I fledged them for 4 weeks? And so I only fledged them for 2 weeks the first year, then I went to 4 weeks. And I did still clip wings back then. That was back in the day when it was just considered mandatory. Every veterinarian said you have to clip your bird's wings. Everybody said you had to clip your bird's wings. But I never removed flight all at once. I would take flight from the first 2 flight feathers, let them get used to that for a week or 2, then take the next 2, and then tailor that wing trim to the young parrot. And they seemed to do fine to me. And then there was a year when just coincidentally the adopting families could not pick them up when within the usual time frames. Babies, usually mine, went home between 16 and 20 weeks. And these babies were staying with me till they were 6 or 7 months old. And so I thought, well, why clip wings early? Why not just let them continue to fledge and fly? And so they did. They flew for about 6 weeks. And when I gradually clipped them back, it broke my heart. I saw the most incredible change in their joie de vivre, whatever you want to call it. It was sort of like they'd had the stuffing knocked out of them. And I decided after that I would never clip wings again. So the last couple of years I sent all babies home fully flighted and trained to fly to my hand on cue. And I always required that people came and picked babies up. I never shipped them, so they hand carried them home. And they would spend 2 days and nights at my house and, get to know the babies and learn how to recall them and that sort of thing. So that was the process I went through, and I learned so much about the development of baby parrots. And if you have the opportunity to observe this, you really should, because baby parrots are so different in the way that they explore their environment than adult parrots are. And I also began to understand the process of becoming food independent and how to facilitate that, and understand the process of fledging and how they become skilled at flight, because it really is fascinating. There's an urge to fly, but the development of flight skills is a whole other thing. And in the beginning, it's a little hair-raising. They do crash. I watched one baby fly right into a wall and slide down to the floor. But there are ways to make it safer, which I employed. That didn't mean that they didn't have accidents. But typically, if it's a baby parrot and they're fledging for the first time, they don't generally have the muscle development to really hurt themselves when they fly into things. They're kind of weak at flying, and so I never had an injury or anything doing this. This is how I raised them. This is a stacking cage, which I hate, but it was perfect for my uses. So, I would leave the babies with the parents for between 2 and 4 weeks. Then I'd bring them inside. They'd be in a great big cardboard box with just the front open so that they could come out and peek at the environment if they wanted to, and they could retreat and hide if that was their preference, so that they had a choice about when and how they began to interact with the environment. And when they were ready, I would move them into this bottom cage here, and it was close enough to the floor that they could toddle out and toddle back in again. And it was perched kind of low, so they began to develop their physical skills. And then when they were ready, I would move them up to this middle cage. And I created this whole area here, much to my husband's dismay. There was a banister here, and I called this African Alley. I actually even had a sign. And so there was a cage at this end and a cage at the other end, and then in between, and this is a cool way to provide enrichment, I would use Christmas tree stands and put in them PVC pieces that were about 4 inches in diameter and then put fresh branches in them. So the babies had this whole runway and fresh branches to chew on and to climb and, you know, develop their physical skills a little more. But this is how they fledged. When they were ready, they came. I didn't do anything. I left this all to them. When they were ready, they came out of this little door, they perched here, and that was where they took off from. And it was fascinating, I have to tell you. So I think this is the first really essential skill that we need as behavior consultants because as Stephanie pointed out, you know, I don't think Sweden is the only country in the European Union that has created laws against wing clipping. And there's more and more of a movement in the United States for considering the allowance of flight. And so more clients are questioning the need to clip wings, but they really don't understand anything about flight. And that's a problem because that will become a risk to their birds. Moreover, there's quite a movement towards free flight. People are learning this on the internet. It's a disaster. It really is a disaster. So they need guidance and assistance in making this decision because the sad truth is there are some birds that are not good candidates for flight. If you have a very, very aggressive parrot, you know, you need to get that behavior under control, you know, gain some compliance before you consider allowing that bird to have full flight. Otherwise, he'll just have a lot wider range of attack. And again, very fat older birds may not be good candidates for flight because the problem is you can let their flight feathers grow out, but they still won't fly. And that too puts the bird at risk, in my opinion, because people are stupid. And so they will take that bird outside and doesn't fly. It does not equate with can't fly. And so you get that bird startled and there's a breeze and now it's up in a tree and there's no way that bird can get back down again. So the assessment of whether a parrot is a good candidate for flight must be made very carefully, and the same is true of the caregiver and the home as well. You know, if you have triplets and they have their friends over all the time, perhaps you could accommodate a flighted parrot, but you know, the assessment would need to be done very, very carefully. And I would assert that we're the ones that are in the best position to be doing that, not some guy on YouTube or Facebook or wherever. So in terms of understanding flight, for one thing, it should never, ever be removed all at once. I have encountered people who are just lazy about getting wing trims, and so their birds will start to fly because some birds, like small cockatoos and cockatiels, small conures, they do regain flight really quickly no matter what, no matter how long they've been clipped. And people will take them in. So let's say this bird's been flying for 3 months, and I've had this happen as a veterinary technician, and then they bring the bird in because it's getting uppity and they want a wing trim. And to me, that was one of the saddest things I've ever experienced. You know, unfortunately, I worked for vets who would do that. But the correct response is, no, I won't do that. I won't remove flight from your bird all at once. Let's take off the first couple of feathers, see how he does at home. You bring him back in 2 weeks. We won't charge you again. We'll take the next couple off, you know, and this is, you know, hopefully we can come to some agreement within the veterinary community about that. Again, you know, we need to understand who is a good candidate for flight or for having a flighted parrot, you know, what kind of homes can safely accommodate a flighted parrot. And we need to understand about safety for flighted parrots as well, because there really is a whole protocol. You know, for one thing, you want to make sure that that bird has good flight skills, and that's the caregiver's responsibility. So that bird needs to know how to fly upward. It needs to know how to fly downward. If you don't have a 2-story house, you better take that bird over to somebody else's house where that can be practiced. And the bird also needs to have a rock-solid recall. He needs to have spent time outside in an outdoor aviary so that he's used to the sights and sounds of the outdoors. That way, if he does get outside by accident, then he's much less likely to startle and fly far away. And then also, you know, the caregiver, we have to know and be able to coach the caregiver how to recover lost parrots, because they behave differently when they get outdoors. When a bird who lives in a home gets outside, he will only vocalize in the early morning and in the evening. So if he gets outside at 9 a.m., it makes sense to stay in that area if you have not seen where he's gone, and, you know, try and get him to vocalize back, call, see if you can't identify his location. By 11 o'clock, you're wasting your time. You might as well go inside and make posters and call all the veterinary clinics and bird stores and, you know, anybody else you can think of who might be contacted if someone found a lost parrot. And then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you get back out there again until it's dark, because that's when that bird is going to vocalize again. And just recently, I had a client, I heard my phone ring at the veterinary clinic, and I thought, I better just go check that. And I did, and it was a message from a client of mine who said she had just lost her kayik outdoors. So I quickly clocked out, went in the break room, called her back. She's in Maryland, I think. And I asked her right then, I said, what time, you know, is it dusk there? What's going on outside? And she said, yeah, it's starting to get dark, so we just gave up. And I said, damn no, you get your butt right out there. And you look low, you look medium, he may not be in a tree, you know, but this is the time of day when you're gonna find him. And she called me back in 5 minutes, and she had him. So, you know, we may very well all be put in that position someday, and we need to be prepared to help people out with that. And in terms of understanding flight, there really is no substitute for hands-on experience. And, you know, this is an ongoing theme throughout this presentation, because that's how I became a decent parrot behavior consultant, was by getting hands-on experience. Because back when I started, there was no parrot division in IAABC, there was no continuing education, there was no nothing. So I would consider, I mean, obviously the best way to learn about flight is to keep flighted parrots yourselves, because then you'll learn, I mean, there's so much that goes into it. You have to make your possessions less attractive than their possessions. You need way more perches up high. You know, there are many, many tricks to keep a flighted parrot successfully in the house. And, you know, you have to be an excellent trainer in order to maintain compliant behaviors. But if that's not possible, you know, see if there's not a breeder around who fledges her babies, and see if you can't clean cages in order to be a part of that experience. Observe flighted parrots whenever possible. But also, you know, don't forget to research flight and feathers. You can learn a huge amount about flight from different textbooks. And I have the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Ornithology, and it is a wonderful, wonderful book. It's not a recent one, but, you know, the anatomy of birds doesn't change very much. And so, and I did double check, it is still available on Amazon, even though it's an older book. And then the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a handbook of bird biology. That also is an excellent resource as well. And then I'd like us to consider the best use for the IAABC discussion list. It's very quiet, and I'm not sure why that is. You know, I suspect that perhaps some of us are not so crazy about showing our weaknesses or the areas where we lack information. Perhaps we're worried about other people coming down on us. But I think we all need to be brave, because we have a virtual classroom available to us that we're not making use of. And it just is ridiculous. It is, you know. So I think all of us in this room can be starters of these conversations, you know. I've never lived with a flighted parrot. What's it like? You know, we can all chime in. I mean, what a better way than to learn from each other in each of these areas. So let's do it. So, here I was breeding African greys, but I was never crazy about breeding birds. I did it because I wanted to breed my own African greys, and I was just fascinated by the process of raising these babies. But I only did it for about 7 years, and I only produced maybe 8 to 10 babies a year. But even still, I felt guilty about doing it, because I already had the conviction that we did not need more captive parrots in the United States. And at the same time, I had been participating in several internet discussion lists, and back then they were of really pretty high quality. We had some very knowledgeable people who were very generous with their time and were sharing that information. And so I started participating on these lists at the same time that I was engaging in my breeding efforts. And I had people start to come to me asking for information. I think I do just innately understand birds pretty well and prey animals pretty well. And so even though I didn't have a lot of experience, I was still being asked for information. And I was being asked for second opinions, basically, because back then the behavior approaches that were being used were very dominance-based, very force-based. Force that parrot to step up, push your hand right into his chest, make him do it. And caregivers, oddly enough, weren't really happy with this. And so, they would call me to see if I had a different approach. And so I decided at that point that if I was going to really be the best behavior consultant I could be, I'd better get as much hands-on experience as I possibly could. And so I was living in California in this great big house, with a great big upstairs that was all open, living room, dining area, kitchen, and I had already built outdoor aviaries for the parrots that I already had, because I was like a lot of people. I wasn't very smart. After I got my first one, it was like potato chips, so by that time I probably had 4 or 5. And so I started taking in birds that people thought were hopeless. And I never got a 501c3, I just did this informally. But really, it was one of the best decisions that I ever made because I was able to learn from the parrots themselves. I dealt with a lot of individuals. And it was terrific. I would take them in, I would get them on a better diet. That was how I learned to do that. And just FYI, although it seems like nobody can do it, transitioning a bird from seed to pellets can be done very easily without that bird ever being hungry. It is a simple process, and it's the same thing for the smaller birds as well. And so I would, as I encountered these individuals with different problems, I'd talk to all these different people and then implement their suggestions, see what worked, see what didn't, kept the things that worked. And then, people who thought they wanted a baby African gray sometimes went home with an Amazon or a rose-breasted cockatoo. So it worked. So from that experience, I learned, how to convert any parrot from a seed mix to a better diet, and also how different species interact with different toys. They are very different, and I used to do these little experiments where I would make the same toy. I'm like Stephanie, I haven't bought a toy for any of my birds in the last year. They're all made at home. And so I would make the same toy. And if you make a toy on a leather thong that is wood slat bead, wood slat bead, wood slat bead, and so on, all the Amazons and macaws were chewing up the wood like crazy and left all the beads on the string in most cases. The African grays, they're all trying to untie the knot at the bottom, and when they do, everything falls to the bottom. So there are some species differences, and it's valuable to us to understand what those are. They also behave differently in outdoor aviaries, which I found interesting. I always, as I said, I had several from medium-sized to large, and I always made sure that a good portion of the roof was covered so they had a choice. They could seek shelter or be out in the sun. And the New World birds would almost always spend some time in the sun and then retreat and spend most of the day in the shade. The African grays would stay in the sun almost all day long. And in fact, one day I about had a heart attack because I came around the side of the house and one of the African grays was on the floor of the aviary, face down, wings spread out, and I was sure she was dead. She was sunbathing. So, and then also, I learned about the most appropriate cages, play stands, other products, how to motivate parrots for training. So this is skill number 2 that I think we all need to have. And this is another one. Margie and I go back and forth about this because she very much believes this is within the purview of the veterinary community. I think it is. However, most veterinarians are recommending A formulated diet like Harrison's pellets comprise about 70 to 80% of the diet. Some are more hardcore. They say it has to be all pelleted. I've only heard of one vet ever who still recommends a seed mix because she's convinced that pellets cause crop impaction. But I don't think that our own ideas, my guess is, they're not that different from the veterinary community. I mean, they may differ a bit in terms of the percentage of pellets that a parrot should eat, but the truth is, parrots need a default diet. We have enough natural disasters and things that happen in our lives that they need a diet that we can pour out of a bag, that they will eat happily, that will contribute to the best health. And that's either going to be a seed mix or it's going to be a pelleted diet. And then many times also in our consultations, you know, resolution of a behavior problem is going to depend upon the caregiver doing some training, maybe implementing some foraging opportunities, and parrots eating a seed mix diet are not motivated to engage in those things. They've got all the high-fat food they want in that dish, and so many times converting a bird to a better diet is necessary to even implement some of these other behavior change strategies. And not only that, as behavior consultants, why should we not also be advocates for the parrot's long-term health and happiness? As a veterinary technician, I am sick to death of having birds arrive on the doorstep dead in the agonal stages, and the owner says, well, I just noticed he was off yesterday. And I don't doubt that. Maybe they weren't very observant, but parrots are very good at hiding signs of illness. And so at any rate, I think we have to be involved in some way with this process. And I've also found, as I think I mentioned this morning, that vets can recommend this, but they don't have the time to actually see that it happens. And so it's very, very common for people to go home from the veterinary clinic with the handouts and with the pelleted food, and they never are successful in getting that bird onto a formulated diet simply because they don't know how to do it. So I think we all need to be well versed in nutrition. And that is just a matter of study. I think we need to understand the function in the body of different categories of nutrients and how they affect behavior. Protein can be used for energy, but that's not the body's first choice. Typically, protein is used for the replacement of tissues. And, it is fats and carbohydrates that are used for energy. And I am convinced that if a bird is on a high-fat, high-carb diet, you're going to have more behavior problems. And I have seen cases. I had one where people with a scarlet macaw came to me, and we did a consultation, but they were going on vacation in just a couple of weeks. And so all they wanted to do was change the diet. And so they did accomplish that. And then when they got back, they said, oh my God, we can't believe how much better he is. Just changing the diet implemented an improvement in his behavior. I also think that we need to understand the differences amongst different formulated diets. Not all pellets are created the same. I would never recommend a heavily dyed, extruded pellet. I feed my birds Harrison's, and that's my first go-to in recommendations to clients, although I think Rowdy Bush is a fair choice for birds like cockatiels and eclectus, and there are a couple of others as well that are not extruded and that don't contain dyes. Also, I think we need to hone our critical thinking skills and help clients to debunk myths about nutrition, like the one that I mentioned earlier, that macaws have to have lots of nuts. That's just ridiculous. It might make sense if those nuts contained nutrients that no other food contains, but they don't. I'll give you an example. I mean, there's so much we don't understand about nutrition that interests me, but if you go back to parrots living in the wild, let's take African greys. Most of the soils in Africa are very high in selenium. So it would then follow that the foodstuffs in Africa are high in selenium. Therefore, it may be that African greys have developed a higher level for selenium than perhaps other species. I'm hypothesizing here, although I think it's likely that such a correlation exists. And so that's another reason why I don't recommend 100% pelleted diet. I think we really need to feed a lot of variety. So Brazil nuts are high in selenium, but so are mushrooms. You know, so it just simply is not necessary to feed one food just because a bird eats it in the wild. And again, you know, our list that belongs to us would be a terrific place to share information about this. You know, Stephanie mentioned so many cool things in her presentations that I had not encountered. She's done research I haven't done. How smart would we all be if we shared all of that amongst ourselves? And we've sort of belabored this point today, but we do need to be able to point clients towards good resources for foraging information, and be able to help them with that in terms of helping them develop a shaping plan, and making sure that that activity gets introduced in a way that the parrot accepts it. This is just one idea for a little cockatiel. You can get like a piece of astroturf or a little tray like this with shredded paper, or even pebbles that are too large for them to swallow, and, you know, sprinkle some seeds and maybe some Harrison's fine grind in them, and help them out in that regard. So again, let's share information. One of the best things I ever did was take in birds, you know, and I still do board a few birds. And one of the reasons I board a few birds, very select birds that I know are, to the best of my ability, are healthy, is so I can continue to practice this stuff, because my birds all know all of it. But it's very beneficial to start with a brand new bird and start over again. You know, that is how you're really going to gain a huge repertoire of interventions and ways to accomplish things. You know, we can volunteer with a rescue organization and help out with birds there. That's another very viable way to get this information and experience. And I mentioned this earlier, so I won't say too much, but having knowledge of products also, and being able to come up with unique solutions. I happen to have 2 clients right now who are lovely, and they really, really want to implement all of my recommendations, but they are very limited in terms of finances. So, you know, I would have liked them to buy coiled rope perches and hang them from the ceiling, and atoms, and have a separate play stand. But instead, I said, go to Goodwill and get a basket, a natural fiber basket, you know, that's not painted, that's wide enough in the base that it's not going to tip over, of a, you know, appropriate size perch. You can move it from room to room, and you can fill the base full of it, full of all kinds of interesting things. So I think it's on us to come up with creative solutions to help these folks out, no matter how much money they have. And the amount of loyalty that is generated between a client and a consultant when you help them out this way is huge. When you can guide them towards the products that their parrots really will interact with, so that they're not spending money. You just can't say to somebody, well, go buy some more toys. You know, it just doesn't work. They're going to buy things that the parrot will not interact with. They're going to be disappointed, and they're going to be mad at you. And I've seen all kinds of creative ideas. Cheryl Kelso has a slew of kaiques, and she once published a picture on Facebook of, you know, those hanging baskets for fruits and vegetables that are 3-tiered. That's a play gym for her kaiques. You know, you got to be careful, of course, about mesh size so toes can't get caught. You got to assess the risk. You know, my parrots happen to really, really love my pot rack. So I never cook without washing those things. So I think, you know, one of the things I was doing when I was living in California and taking in birds was, if I needed a cage, I bought every kind of cage there was. And I came to find out some of them sucked and some of them were great. So the more you can experiment with things and really get some hands-on experience with them, the better. And remember that, you know, whatever you recommend to a client has to be doable. This is one of my favorite perches. This is called an Ava Station. And Nyla Kopp of My Birdie Buddy makes these, and she also makes hanging ones as well. So I have 2 of these freestanding play stands and 2 Ava hangs that hang from the ceiling. And they're just marvelous because the Ava hangs have a spring inside. So when the parrots land on them, they bounce and they spin around, and there's places to hang toys, and they're just great. But that's not something you're going to see advertised in a magazine, you know, so searching the web for these sorts of things can be very, very valuable. And then we can get on our list and say, I found this. What do you guys think about this? Does anybody have experience with this? That way we don't all have to buy everything. So then I was wrapping up my breeding efforts, and I was down to 17 parrots. And as it turns out, my husband was not appreciating my efforts at self-education. So he gave me an ultimatum. It was either him or the parrots. And so I made the obvious choice. Bye. And so I kind of went on a fishing expedition. Because even though I was generating income as a consultant, I thought I needed benefits and a full-time income just to protect myself. And so when I thought, well, what would I like to do? I thought, well, I'd like to work in a veterinary clinic because I'd like to see the medical side of parrot care as well. So I just kind of went on a fishing expedition. I sent resumes to clinics in Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona. And oddly enough, Dr. Hilmer, who owned Oak Hills Veterinary Clinic, had already referred a couple of clients to me. And he was feeling very lonely in his clinic because every single staff member there hated bird owners, and he was really the only one. So he glommed on to me, and it had never occurred to me that I could become a veterinary technician, because in California you had to go to school for that and then become licensed. But lo and behold, in Oregon, you could work on the job, accumulate 4,000 hours of experience, and then study and take the national boards and become licensed. That's no longer the case, but he offered me a veterinary technician position rather than a reception position. So I said, awesome, I moved to Oregon. And as it turned out, I mean, learning to be a technician in 60 days was pretty hair-raising, but the medical field was really a pretty good fit for me. You know, I liked learning to draw blood and place IV catheters and monitor anesthesia and make up prescriptions and do things like that. But of everything I learned, the best thing I learned was to have really good communication skills. This was a very generous veterinarian who sent us to lots of CE. Any CE you wanted, it was fine. He would pay for it, and he would pay for your hours while you were there as well. So I really took advantage of that, and the veterinary field is a very real-life laboratory in communication because you've got clients, you've got animals, and you have team members. And I learned a lot of really super valuable tips, like if you're talking to someone and their toes are pointed at you, you know you have their full attention. If you're talking to them and they're standing like this, they're really wanting to get out of there. You know, there are so many small things about communication, you know, including listening and nonverbal communication skills. And this is really the truth. 65% of all of our communication is nonverbal. Wow. And only 35% of it is verbal. So obviously this poses quite a challenge for those of us who do consultations mostly by telephone. So I learned that listening is a discipline. And honest and truly, if you practice it really well, you're amazing at what you can achieve. Because I can, you know, when I do a consultation, I send a set of written recommendations, and then I schedule follow-ups at 1-week intervals until I'm sure they're doing well, and then I extend it to 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks, and then so on. And eventually, sometimes they graduate. But I can actually get on the phone with a client and from their tone of voice know that something is wrong. And I can address that right out the gate. And in most cases, they're feeling discouraged. And if I had not opened that door, who knows if they would have admitted that, you know? So I learned to watch very carefully my own tone of voice and my own body language. You know, veterinary receptionists learn that you better answer that phone with a smile, because if you're smiling, your voice sounds different than if you're not smiling. So there is a whole lot that goes into verbal communication and to reading a client's body language. And then also in terms of communication skills, a multimedia approach is really essential when you're delivering information. Some people learn better when they hear information. Some people learn better when you write the information down. But I will never not give a written set of recommendations because I have a record, the client has a record. You know, there's many, many times when they come to me and they say, well, what about this? And I've already written it down for them step by step in their recommendations, and so I can save myself a lot of time by referring them back to that. And then it's also important to speak at the client's level, and this is something else I learned in the veterinary clinic, in that, you know, we always put prompts into our software. Client is a pediatrician, you know, client is a neurologist. So if I'm going in there to present a treatment plan, I'm going to talk about a CBC and a chem panel and radiographs. But if I'm talking to a layperson, I'm not going to speak that way. And the same is true. We have to take this into consideration also. I don't have a behavior questionnaire on my website on purpose. I prefer to send it to the client as an email attachment and receive it as an email attachment because it gives me a great deal of information about their educational level and their skills in terms of using technology and things like that. So it gives me valuable information in terms of how I need to speak to that client and oftentimes how I need to assist that client. And I also learned to understand things from the client's perspective. I learned that, you know, folks who come into a veterinary clinic can be very intimidated by language, by the medical language that we use. I mean, we get so interested or so used to talking about cytologies and things like that. It's just automatic, and we forget that stuff is Greek to these clients. Also, people who have problems with their pets, they feel guilty. They feel bad that they have to seek help, and they fear that they're going to be judged. And they feel defensive, and in the case of our clients, they may feel very victimized as well. And so it's very important that we keep all of this in mind when we get on the telephone or do a consultation in person with a client. So I think it is important to use an intake form. It allows you to get a lot of information, as I said, not just about the bird, but about the client. I also, on my form, I ask the same question in many different ways on purpose. No client has ever picked up on that yet or commented on that, but it gets me a lot of valuable information, especially about the type of social relationships that exist in the home. And then again, I provide written summaries. And I think in terms of communication skills, we need to address lack of compliance with respect and compassion, but it needs to be addressed. And when I say clearing up the quiet, what I mean is when you're delivering recommendations, you know, if you're in person, you can watch the body language, watch the facial expression and all of that. If you're on the telephone, if you notice that the client's voice gets a little quieter, a little softer, they start speaking a little more slowly, that person may have just gotten out of the game. And it's important that we say, your voice just changed, you know. Are you confused by what I'm saying? Is this something that you think you're not going to be able to do? You know, tell me a little bit about what's going on with you. In my experience, people value that tremendously, that awareness that you show them. And, you know, at that point in time, you're their friend. You're on their side. And they will step up to the plate. But also in terms of addressing a lack of compliance, sometimes clients who are not making progress will say to me, well, I've done everything you recommended. And I know that's not true. So I'll just say, well, let's look at the written recommendations and just kind of go through them and see where we're at and maybe what the next steps will be. You know, maybe we've gotten off track a little bit or something. You know, they've always not done what I said. And so you can make them psychologically aware of themselves. I call it making them psychologically visible. But, you know, occasionally there will be a client who just will not follow through. And I don't think that we can take that personally. And this is how I look at it, that we are in the lighting business. Our job is to shed light on all the things that the client doesn't know. And then even with the greatest support, sometimes they will choose not to implement what we say. So in terms of developing communication skills, I think this is easy. There are lots of courses online, lots of information online about communication skills. You'll have so many choices, you won't even know which one to choose from. If your written skills are weak, for God's sake, take a class and practice and practice and practice and become comfortable with conflict resolution. You know, I wish I could immediately think of a different term for it, because it doesn't always have to be conflict, but you need to clear up misunderstandings and step into that space and find out what's going on with that client so that you can get back on track. And there is an excellent book, Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When the Stakes Are High, that I think is a great resource. Other things I learned in the veterinary practice had to do with discipline. The first clinic I worked at was a very, very disciplined clinic. All team members, when they were hired, were told behavior is a condition of employment, and this is how you will behave. And it was an amazing clinic. It was an amazing clinic. We did such good work, and it was largely because everyone there really behaved as a professional. And one of our standards was that only positive things leave the clinic. And what that meant was you did not say anything bad about a team member or a client or a vendor or anyone. And there was no gossiping allowed, period, end of subject. I was also taught that I represent the clinic at all times, even when I am off work, and that when I am there especially, I need to behave and dress professionally. I must behave with patience and respect and empathy towards clients, no matter what I think of them, and that I've got to maintain a rapport with the client while advocating for the pet. And that has translated very well into my consulting practice, because you do have to advocate for the pet, but it's the client who's paying your bills. And so you've got to find that fine balance. So skill number 6 that I would say that is essential to us is that of respect. Just like people say love is a verb, respect is a verb. It's a skill, it's a discipline that we must all think about and learn to practice, because it is so easy to let it get away from us at times when we're tired or we're in a bad place, we're worried about a pet. So that's why we've got to practice it. And we all know bird people are really special, right? So it can help us in this regard, so that we don't slip into any sort of impatience or sarcasm when we're talking to an especially difficult client. So obviously there's no way to learn this. I think we all know what this means. One of the things that I do is, you know, there are some clients I like better than others, of course. There are others I find very, very draining, and with whom I am tempted to feel a great degree of impatience. And so before I get on the phone with a client, I'll go into my office, I get quiet, I focus on my breathing, I start thinking about that person, what life is like for that person, what struggles they're having, you know, how they how they might feel about all the work they're putting into this. And that allows me to get on the phone and be very kind and very compassionate, no matter what I might think in my off time about that client. And to me, that is an exceptionally valuable practice, because, you know, even if your words sound friendly, that client, even if you're on the phone, is going to pick up the felt sense of your emotions. So we've got to remember all the challenges that the client has, and remember to use positive reinforcement with them at every opportunity. You know, Julie Murad is a great example of this. You know, we took an Uber to dinner, and she complimented the Uber driver as soon as we got in the car and as soon as we got out. And she complimented the people in the restaurant. And, you know, she was such a good role model for me, because I was feeling exhausted, and I thought, you know, that's awesome. I could be doing that. I should be doing that. But thank God she's doing that. you know, for all of us, because we've got to remember it's the client who's paying our bills. And I have been slightly disturbed because it has come to my attention that there has been online a certain degree of bad-mouthing of clients amongst AABC members, and I think we need to nip that right in the bud when that happens and when we see it. So I would suggest that in terms of practicing with respect within our community, that we don't speak in a negative manner about our clients or our peers or any others in the field. And I think we need to remember that we all represent IAABC, whether we're here at a convention or in our homes, and to behave accordingly. And I think we need to work towards a more respectful relationship within the veterinary community. This is a great source of angst for me, because early on, when people were getting into behavior work, they had no knowledge about behavior. What was being published was mythology, it was very damaging, and the veterinarians were very quick to pick up on this. And I myself have been the recipient of a great deal of extremely disrespectful behavior from veterinarians at conferences when they became aware of the fact that I was a behavior consultant. So this is an area where we have a great deal of work to do. And as was mentioned by an earlier speaker, more and more veterinarians are taking on this role of behavior consultant as well. But I can tell you, having worked in the veterinary field, there is no way for that to happen effectively within the constraints of a veterinary schedule, unless they completely revamp their appointment schedule. And there's not really any way that, I mean, maintaining a profitable vet clinic is not an easy thing, and there's no way they can even charge appropriately for this. So through IABC, if we can establish our credibility to a much higher level within the veterinary community, I think Parrots will be much better off for that. And I also think that we can't be hypocrites. You know, we can't embrace the use of positive reinforcement and then behave otherwise in the rest of our lives. We can't. So here I was working as a veterinary technician full-time, and I only had to work 4 days a week, although they were super long days. And then I was doing my consulting on the 3 days I had off, and apparently I thought that I wasn't busy enough. So Chris Shank and Barbara Heidenreich and I put our heads together, and we decided, let's put on annual positive parrot training retreats, and so we did. These were 5-day intensives that we held once a year. People came from all over the world. They brought their parrots, and it was a splendid mix of information about how to solve behavior problems, how to convert parrots to a better diet, how to address motivation issues, you know, applied behavior analysis, training demonstrations. They trained their own parrots. They clicker trained chickens. We trained goldfish one year. We did shaping plans with the horses. It was remarkable. And this, in case you're interested, is the graduating class from 2 years ago. Some of them are showing their certificates, and see who's there, Julie? I saw. So it was quite extraordinary. It was really a fun time. I don't think we're going to do it anymore. But this is where I got what training skills I...
It was fantastic. We're never doing it.
Well, you know, sooner or later, as you age, you begin to want to spend your time as well as you possibly can. And it does come down to, are you going to help this one parrot caregiver, or are you going to create an ebook where you can help 40,000 parrot caregivers, you know? So somebody younger than I needs to take this over. But, you know, that was where I learned to be a good trainer, because I had to have my own training skills. But boy, to learn something, if you coach somebody else how to train, that is really where you can refine things for yourself. And I learned how to develop shaping and counter conditioning plans, how to teach medical behaviors. But perhaps the most valuable thing I learned was to have a great deal of compassion for people, because I saw how difficult it is for people to implement things even when they see it demonstrated for them. So this gentleman came with his wife, and they brought their 2 parrots. And the wife does really well with the parrots. She's got kind of a natural talent. This guy has no natural talent at all. So both of the birds were biting him. He couldn't get them to step up, and he was really upset about it. But his body language was all wrong, and so we corrected his body language. We taught him the correct approach. He was there for 5 days, and all he accomplished was learning how to step those birds up. But for him, it was a milestone, and it was a success. You know, he was smiling at the end of it. He's the one holding the selfie stick out there. But there was a very strange thing that happened, because he was having a problem. Once he got the birds to step up, they would just run right up to his shoulder. And we didn't think that was optimal, since they enjoyed biting him so many times in the past. So Barbara Heidenreich did a direct demonstration. He was going to work with his little Senegal, and it was not a jumper. So she said, this is how I want you to hold your hand, so that the bird can perch here, and he is not likely to go down your arm and then back up to your shoulder again. And within 2 seconds, he stepped the bird up to practice that, and he held his arm like this. And I had to go over and physically reposition his arm. So that is how hard it can be for people, no matter how well-intentioned they are. So we can't afford to get impatient with these folks when they need to hear it 20 times. You know, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. So I think we've got to have good training skills ourselves. We've got to know how to design shaping plans and implement those, just so that we can help clients introduce new toys and other items, teach parrots how to bathe, how to step up, and how to teach new behaviors. If we cannot do that with our own birds, we don't have a whisper or a prayer of being able to help our clients with these things. So I think it's very important that we all learn to live as a trainer, and that to the extent possible that we teach our clients to do this as well. Because I'm constantly thinking, like, I have one little African gray Susie, and she was pair bonded to her first owner to the point where he was a hostage. He couldn't even go to the bathroom without taking her with him, because otherwise she'd vocalize, and it made his girlfriend mad. And so anyway, when I adopted her, because I hated the both of them so much and they wanted to give her up, she would just constantly fly to my shoulder, constantly fly to my shoulder. So that required a great deal of awareness in me, because my goal for her was that she live as a more independent bird and learn independent living skills. And so, it's like second nature when a bird flies to your shoulder to just reach up and pet him. But, if I had to be aware. I have to be aware every moment with my own birds. What am I teaching them in that moment? So when she flew to my shoulder, I never scritched her head. And in fact, I bounced her off. She had great flight skills, and that was a bit of an aversive thing to do, but it worked for us. So I would bounce her off and bounce her off and bounce her off. And as soon as she stopped, that was when we started working on the recall. So she got her way. She got to fly to me. She got reinforced for that. She got head scratches and food treats. But I was the teacher rather than her being the teacher. There are still some training retreats that are being presented. Hillary Hankey did one just this last year in California. If you have the availability to go to one of those, it is a great experience. And train every chance you get. If you've got a rescue organization, see if you can't come in one day a week and train their birds. See if your friends will let you train their birds. I mean, try and get as much hands-on experience as you possibly can. So behavior consulting I've been doing for about 20 years. And I started back in about 1997. That was when the myth of height dominance was at its height. Parrots were being kept down low. People were doing crazy stuff like cutting the legs off their cages, keeping the cages on the ground. It was total mythology that was being published. Negative reinforcement and positive punishment were really the norms for working with parrots. So how I became a behavior consultant? As I said, I was having people coming to me, calling me for information, and gradually I was spending more time at this. And I knew Sally because I was writing for her magazine, and a lot of what I wrote, by the way, was probably mythology as well, because I was learning from people who didn't know what they were talking about. And And I was also working as assistant editor of her magazine as well. So we talked frequently. And one day I said to her, God, I'm spending so much time at this, I think I'm going to have to start charging. And she said, well, I think it's high time you did. And I said, well, really, do you think I'm qualified? And she said, well, I think you're as qualified as anybody else out there doing it. So that's how many of us became behavior consultants. You know, there was no organization for education or to promote the field or anything else. There's very few of us still around, but I know Julie remembers those days. But in terms of behavior consulting, the most important lessons I've learned were how to motivate people, about the triggers that cause increased production of reproductive hormones, the impact of those on behavior, and the value of the pair bond to the caregiver as well. So in terms of motivating people, I discovered along the way something very interesting. A certain amount of scientific research has produced what's called the Goldilocks rule. And this graphic is from a newsletter that James Clear publishes. If you do not subscribe to his newsletter, you should. He is amazing in terms of some of the advice that he gives about motivation, establishing productive habits, things like this. For instance, one of his newsletters, he's really an original forward thinker. And one of the things that he said was, throw out your goals. There is no purpose in having goals because they actually will be detrimental in many respects in that they create anxiety, they create guilt. What you really need are systems. So it's fine to have the goal of losing 10 pounds, but if you don't have systems in place to achieve that, you're never going to be successful. So what are your systems going to be? You know, are you going to have meatless Mondays? Are you going to walk a mile a day to start and then increase to 2 miles? I mean, that may seem like common sense, but to me, it was a bit of a new thought, and it changed the way that I now work in my own practice. So it's well worth subscribing to. I learned about it from John Dickerson on CBS Sunday Morning, and I thought, if it's good enough for that guy, it's good enough for me. But this was something else that James Clear wrote about in one of his newsletters, and it was about human motivation and the science that has been done on that. And what has been concluded is that humans will experience their peak motivation when they're working on tasks that are right at the edge of their current abilities. And the analogy he gave was that of a tennis game. If you're an average tennis player and you have a tennis game with a 4-year-old, you're going to be bored out of your skull and you're going to want to stop before the 4-year-old wants to, probably. If you schedule a match with Serena Williams or somebody who's a top tennis player, you're going to feel frustrated. But so you want a partner who's just slightly better than you. And to me, this was an invaluable lesson. And by the way, it's the same with parrots, right? I mean, whenever you're shaping behavior or training behavior, if you move too fast, the parrot gets frustrated and gets out of the game. If you move too slow, he gets bored and he falls out of the game. So you need to become very, very good at knowing when it is appropriate to move on to that next approximation. So it's the same with clients. And so I used to just send home that whole big program of here's what we're going to do. And now I don't do that. I do include the whole big program because they need that. But in my summary section, I say, okay, week 1, these are your action steps. And we have agreed on that before they've gotten off the phone. And then when I follow up a week later, I say, okay, where are we now? And where are we going to go next? And it has revolutionized my client's success. It really has. It makes it very doable for them. So we have to, for our clients, break down things into tasks of manageable difficulty. Remember to use positive reinforcement with them every single chance we get, and live as a trainer with our clients too, and take responsibility if they're not making progress. Like Susan Friedman said, the rat is never wrong. If we're training an animal and they're not making progress, it is routine for us to re-examine our training plan. We've got to take that same approach with our clients. If they're not making progress, it's on us, and we better figure out a better process. So let's see. I better wrap up here. We already talked about some of this. We talked about the triggers for reproductive hormones. We need to understand them and how to address them, correct the diet, evolve the pair bond, end cavity seeking, sometimes adjust the day length, but not always, and introduce some minimal, I pulled the word stressor out of the air, but let's use experiences, get them out of the house, get that person to invest in an outdoor aviary, take them through the drive-through, to when they go to the bank. I mean, just anything to kind of mix up that parrot's existence. And then we cannot underestimate the value of the pair bond to that client. There's no doubt that all people get animals to meet their own emotional needs. But I believe that that is especially true of bird owners. I see a much higher degree of dysfunction among bird owners than those who have other species. And they are drawn to parrots for a reason. And we also have to realize that they get relief from anxiety and depression from this pair bond. They achieve a sense of being loved from this pair bond. I mean, I've developed this phrase, the love triangle, because in so many of the consultations I do, the bird is pair bonded to the woman and the man is on the outs. Because initially they were having problems in the first place. So clients will have a hard time with changing this, and we need to really carefully coach them through it and give them very specific steps. So this takes very heavy doses of understanding and compassion and patience, excellent communication skills. We need to gain their cooperation about a plan to evolve this, and then develop a very gradual plan that substitutes training for all the lovey-dovey stuff. So just a summary of essential skills. We need to know about flight, all aspects of it, how to improve the parrot's diet, how to teach a bird to forage, have knowledge of the best products out there, have excellent communication skills, practice respect in every way, realize that we are representatives of our profession, not just of ourselves. Have good training skills, know how to motivate our clients as well as birds, understand about the complexities of hormone production and pair bonding, and be willing to face those because they are often an element of our consultations. So thank you very much, everyone. Any questions? Yes?
I had a couple, but I'll see if I can. So you were showing foraging, which I love doing foraging.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also, I like the box idea, not the box, the plastic container.
Uh-huh.
I like
Mm-hmm.
that. But I've had people trying to say to me, well, that triggers hormonal and nesting habits, so don't do that. And I thought that's sort of kind of to watch.
It doesn't in my experience, but it could in different individuals. So with any toy or any type of enrichment that you provide, you do need to observe and watch how the bird interacts with it. In my experience, small birds do not behave in a nesty way with shredded paper. And, I often have heard from veterinarians as well that you should eliminate wood chewing. But I can't see the logic in that, because birds are always chewing, not just when they're breeding. Certainly they do excavate nest sites, but environment makes a big difference, as Stephanie was so eloquent in pointing out. So if you have an African gray in a cage and you give him a whole bunch of wood blocks in the corner, then certainly that bird might begin to use that wood in a way to create a nest in their perception. But if you hang a wood toy in the cage and he's sitting on a perch and chewing on it, in my experience, that does not constitute or encourage nesting behavior. If you gave an African gray a whole bunch of paper to shred up, yes, you might get a lot of clawing, scratching at the floor and nesty behavior, but not a cockatiel in a foraging tray like that. But also, if you have any concerns, use little pebbles that they can't swallow, use AstroTurf, sprinkle it on the floor and let them walk around. I mean, there's a million ways to do it, and that just happened to be the photo that I had. But I think you bring up a very good point that has within a broader context, in that you're going to be met and questioned by clients on a lot of different things. Like, I will never again recommend using egg cartons to make toys on the internet, because I will be slammed by 50,000 people about the dangers of salmonella. I have given my birds egg cartons for 40 years. You know, I think there's very little risk. Parrots don't swallow the egg cartons. Parrots don't have saliva that allows things to so easily move into their mouths. You know, but there's egg cartons for sale on the internet that haven't been used. So, you know, that's just part of consulting, I think, is talking through these things with clients. They're always going to have a yes but for you, and that's just part of it. And you know, I charge by time, so fine. Ask me as many frickin' questions as you want about, you know, the risk to my bird of toilet paper rolls or anything else, you know. My time is yours. It's your dime, so.
Sorry, my side comment was the exact same thing on the internet, talking about natural branches in North America.
Oh, God, yes.
Oh. 4 hour, oh, God.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas apparently in Sweden is this normal.
Yes. Yeah. But you know, I think that's another area where it's on us to really grow our knowledge, because a lot of the dangers that have been written about, I believe, are only guesses, because I've never heard a bird yet have any problems with any of them. So there are perceived risks, and then there are certainly very real risks, like that almost nobody knows about, like leather protective spray. If you want to kill your birds, spray your leather couch with leather protective spray with them in the house. They'll be dead within 12 hours. Have you ever heard that? But how many times have you heard that Glade air fresheners are a problem? I've never encountered one bird who's had a problem with them. You know, I don't use them because I don't like artificial scents, but we need a lot more information, a lot more research and sharing of information about things like that as well.